Most people make the biggest mistake with cucumbers right after planting, and they make it because they are trying to help. They plant a healthy cucumber seedling in good soil, give it plenty of water, then come back the next morning and start adding something else because the plant looks a little tired. A little more water, some fertilizer, maybe manure or another homemade mixture, and sometimes they even loosen the soil around the stem because they think the roots need help. I used to do the same thing many years ago, and I learned the hard way that those first few days are not the time to push a cucumber plant. They are the time to leave it alone and let it recover. A cucumber can look perfectly healthy when you put it in the ground, and then suddenly hang down the next afternoon as if something terrible has happened. But that does not always mean the plant is dying. The roots have just been moved, the plant has lost some of its old comfort, and it needs time to reconnect with the new soil. The trouble starts when we see those soft leaves and become nervous. We think the plant needs another drink, then another one, and before we know it the soil is constantly wet and the young roots cannot breathe properly. This is one of those simple gardening mistakes that can cost you weeks of growth and a surprising amount of fruit later in the season. I learned a very different approach from an older gardener who had been growing cucumbers for most of his life. He did not rush around his garden after planting. He watered properly once, watched the weather, protected the young plants from cold nights and harsh heat, and then gave the roots time to do their work. That simple habit stayed with me because his cucumber plants were always strong and dark green while mine were often struggling. In this video, I want to show you exactly what I do immediately after planting cucumbers so the plants settle faster, build a stronger root system, and have a much better chance of carrying a heavy crop later. There is no expensive product here, and there is no complicated routine. Some of the things I use cost nothing at all. But there is one thing I do during those first 2 days that most gardeners completely overlook. And if you miss it, everything you do afterward becomes harder. The biggest mistake after planting cucumbers is not giving them too little care. It is giving them too much care at the wrong time. I learned that after one spring when I planted a whole row of young cucumbers and became impatient after only a few days. The plants looked a little tired in the afternoon, and I decided they must need food. I mixed a strong fertilizer and poured it around the stems because I wanted those vines to start running as quickly as possible. For a few days everything seemed fine, but then the leaves became weak and the plants almost stopped moving forward. At the time I thought they were hungry, and I was ready to feed them again. But an older gardener stopped me and told me to leave them alone. He said the roots were still recovering from planting, and I was asking a young plant to do too much before it had settled into the soil. That advice changed the way I gardened. After transplanting, cucumber roots need time to reconnect with the soil and begin making new growth. Even when the leaves above the ground look healthy, the roots underneath may still be adjusting. This is why I do not rush into feeding during the first days. The plants need stable moisture, warmth and protection from sudden stress more than they need a bottle of fertilizer. Many gardeners see a cucumber wilt slightly during a hot afternoon and immediately think something is wrong. Sometimes the plant simply needs a little time to recover when the temperature becomes cooler. If the soil is still reasonably moist, adding more water can create another problem instead of solving the first one. I check the soil before watering, and I pay attention to the weather rather than following a fixed schedule. If the ground is dry, I give the plant a gentle drink. If it is still moist, I wait. This simple habit saves water and keeps the young roots from sitting in constantly wet soil. I also avoid digging around the stem during this period. Cucumber roots are close to the surface, and there is very little benefit in disturbing them just because the soil has formed a small crust. A light layer of clean grass, straw, or shredded leaves around the plant can do much more good. It helps keep moisture in the ground, protects the soil from becoming hard, and reduces the need for repeated watering. An old gardener showed me this many years ago, and I still use it because it costs almost nothing and saves work later. But there is another mistake that can undo all of this careful recovery, and it happens when the weather changes suddenly during the first week. I remember one spring when the nights stayed cool for longer than usual, and I thought my newly planted cucumbers simply needed more attention. I covered them during the cold evenings, but then took the protection off too quickly during the day because I was worried they would not get enough light. The plants survived, but they stayed small and weak for much longer than they should have. That taught me another old lesson that I still follow today. After planting, warmth matters just as much as water. Cucumbers are not plants that enjoy cold roots and sudden changes in temperature, especially when they are still recovering from being moved. During the first week, I pay close attention to the nights. If the temperature is dropping, I give the young plants simple protection with a light row cover or another breathable cover that keeps the cold off without pressing down on the leaves. Experienced gardeners have used this kind of protection for years because it gives young cucumbers a quiet period when they can build roots without fighting cold wind every night. There is another reason I like this method because it can also keep cucumber beetles away when the plants are young. I once watched a row of uncovered cucumbers get attacked while another row under lightweight protection remained almost untouched. It was not some expensive system, and it did not require spraying the plants every few days. The important thing is to remember that this protection is temporary. Once the cucumbers begin flowering, I remove the cover so bees and other pollinators can reach the flowers. That small detail is easy to forget, and it matters because protecting a plant too long can create another problem. I also like using yellow sticky traps near young cucumber plants when beetles are common in my garden. They are not a miracle, and they will not catch every insect, but they give me an early warning and reduce the number of beetles reaching the leaves. I would rather notice the first few insects than wait until the leaves are full of holes and the plant is already under stress. This is one of those old practical habits that costs little and saves trouble later. And there is one more thing I watch during these first days that many gardeners completely ignore. I do not judge the cucumber by how much it grows. I judge it by how well it recovers. If the leaves soften during a hot afternoon but look stronger again by evening, I stay calm. But if the plant looks tired early in the morning before the heat begins, I know I need to look more closely at the roots and moisture. That simple morning check can tell me more than any fertilizer label, and it leads to the next step that can decide whether the cucumber becomes strong or stays weak. Now we get to the part I consider most important after planting because this is where I learned to stop trying to improve everything and instead start protecting what is already there. The first thing I do is put a simple layer of mulch around the cucumber plant. I have used old straw, dry grass, and shredded leaves depending on what I had available. You do not need to buy a special garden product for this. The idea is simply to cover the bare soil so the roots do not have to deal with rapid changes in moisture and temperature. Cucumber roots stay fairly close to the surface, so when the sun heats the bare ground, the roots feel that heat much more quickly than we realize. Then the soil cools again at night, and the plant has to adjust over and over. I did not understand how much this mattered until an older neighbor showed me his cucumber bed many years ago. His plants were sitting under a thick layer of old straw, and mine were growing in completely bare soil. We had planted at almost the same time, and yet his plants looked calmer and stronger. He told me that the straw was not feeding the cucumbers overnight as some people claim. It was doing something much simpler. It was keeping the soil more even. That made sense to me, and I started using it every season. I leave a small open space around the actual stem so the mulch is not pressed against it. Then I spread the material around the plant where the roots are likely to be. This also slows evaporation, which means I do not have to run outside every evening with a hose just because the surface looks dry. There is another little detail I learned later that made this method even better. I do not use fresh, thick grass clippings directly against young plants because they can become wet and compacted. I prefer material that is already dry and loose. Then, I water through the mulch when the soil actually needs it. The water reaches the ground slowly instead of hitting the surface hard and washing soil around the stem. Most gardeners think mulch is something you add later when the plants are already large, but I prefer to put it down soon after planting, because those first days are exactly when the roots need stable conditions. And once the mulch is in place, there is one more free thing I do that takes less than a minute, but can make a surprisingly big difference to the future shape of the cucumber plant. Once the mulch is in place, I do one more simple check that has saved me from many problems over the years, and that is checking the soil around the young plant instead of judging the plant only by its leaves. I remember how often I used to look at a cucumber and think it needed something because the leaves were not standing perfectly straight. Now, I look at the ground first. I push my finger into the soil a little way from the stem and see whether it is still cool and moist underneath the mulch. If it is, I leave the plant alone. If it has become dry, I water slowly and deeply instead of giving it a quick splash. This is important because cucumbers need steady moisture, but they do not need to sit in water all the time. The old method I learned was simple. Give the roots a good drink and then let them use it. Do not keep the surface wet every few hours. When the soil stays evenly moist, the roots have a better chance to grow deeper, and the plant is less likely to struggle when the weather becomes hot. There is another small thing I do during the first week that costs absolutely nothing. I walk around the plants in the morning and look for weeds while they are still tiny. People often wait until the weeds are obvious because they think there's not much competition yet. But a young cucumber has a small root system, and a weed growing only a few inches away can take moisture and nutrients from the same part of the soil. If I remove that weed while it is small, the whole job takes less than a minute. I also look closely at the lower leaves and the stem for chewing damage or insects. I am not trying to spray everything I see. I simply want to notice a problem while it is still small enough to handle. This morning, check became one of my best habits because it gives me control without making gardening complicated. I do not need to spend an hour every day. I just need to notice what is happening before a small problem becomes a large one. And there is one final thing I pay attention to during this early stage because it can decide whether those first flowers later become real cucumbers or simply disappear, and most people do not think about it until the harvest has already started to disappoint. By the end of the first week, I am no longer trying to make the cucumber grow faster, because now I am looking for one very simple sign that tells me the plant is ready to move forward. That sign is fresh, new growth. You may notice a new leaf opening from the center, or the growing tip becoming stronger and more upright. The leaves may recover faster after the afternoon heat, and the stem may look firmer than it did on the day you planted it. These small changes are much more important to me than seeing the plant suddenly become large. An old greenhouse grower once told me that you should not measure a young cucumber by how many inches it grows in a day, but by how well it recovers from stress. I remembered that because it is easy to become impatient when you see another garden growing faster. Sometimes the cucumber that looks smaller during the first week is actually building the stronger foundation. The roots are working quietly underneath, and when the plant finally settles, it can suddenly start moving forward much faster. This is also the point when I begin thinking about the first gentle feeding. I do not do it just because 7 days have passed. I wait until I can clearly see that the cucumber is growing again. If the plant is still struggling, I give it more time. If the new leaves are healthy and the soil is warm and stable, I can give a light, natural feed. I like well-finished compost or a mild compost tea because it is simple and does not require buying another expensive bottle. The important thing is not to make the mixture strong. Young cucumbers do not need a heavy dose to prove that they can grow. They need steady support while they continue building roots and leaves. This was another lesson that took me years to understand, because I used to believe that a stronger mixture meant a stronger plant. In reality, the plants that I pushed hardest often became the plants that struggled first. The cucumbers I treated gently usually caught up and passed them later. There is another thing I watch very carefully once the plant begins growing again, and that is the first flowers. I know it is tempting to celebrate every flower because it feels like the harvest is finally beginning, but a young cucumber plant still has work to do before it is ready to carry a heavy load. I want strong roots and a healthy main stem first. That is why I never panic if the first few flowers appear and then disappear. What matters is that the plant continues producing healthy new growth. And if you have protected the young plants with a row cover against cucumber beetles, remember that the cover needs to come off when flowering begins, so bees can reach the flowers and pollination can happen. This is the stage where the quiet work of the first week finally begins to show above the soil, but there is still one final mistake that can turn a strong cucumber into a disappointing harvest, even after everything else has been done correctly. And this is why I always tell people that the first 7 days after planting cucumbers are not about pushing growth. They are about giving the plant the conditions it needs to become strong enough to grow on its own. If you watered deeply when the soil was dry, protected the young plants from cold nights, kept the roots covered with simple mulch, removed small weeds, and watched for insects without disturbing the plant every few hours, you have already done most of the important work. Now, the best thing you can do is continue with the same calm routine. As the vines begin to grow, give them a simple support if you have one, because cucumbers are easier to keep clean and harvest when the vines can climb, instead of lying heavily on wet soil. I have used old sticks, pieces of wire, and simple trellises made from things already lying around the garden. You do not need an expensive structure. The plant only needs something it can hold on to. Then comes another habit that makes a surprisingly large difference. Once the cucumbers begin producing fruit, I walk through the garden every day or two and pick the ones that are ready. I do not wait for them to become huge. When an old cucumber is left hanging on the vine for too long, the plant can spend more of its energy finishing that fruit instead of continuing to produce new ones. Regular harvesting keeps the whole plant working, and it also means you get better tasting cucumbers instead of discovering an enormous yellow one hiding under the leaves. I also keep checking the soil and mulch because summer can change quickly. If the ground becomes dry, I water deeply. If it is still moist, I wait. I never try to fix several dry days with one sudden flood of water. Steady care is much better for the plant than dramatic rescue. And when I look back at all the years I have grown cucumbers, the lesson is very simple. The strongest plants were rarely the ones that received the most products. They were the ones that received steady moisture, good soil, warmth, protection, and attention at the right time. That old approach saves money, saves work, and gives you something even better than a large harvest. It gives you confidence because you know what to do when the next cucumber plant goes into the ground. And the next time you plant cucumbers, remember this first week, because there is another old method I use later in the season that can help keep the vines producing when most gardens are already slowing down.